dive into an intense story of bravery and redemption. When the former Marine Daniel makes a routine stop at a quiet diner, he notices something off. A young girl named Lily is with a man who seems far too controlling. Trusting his instincts, Daniel steps in and saves her, but the story is far from over. As the truth behind Lily's past is uncovered, Daniel finds himself deeply involved in her recovery and in a battle to protect her from even more danger. What unfolds next will change both their lives forever. Curious to see how it ends? Drop a comment and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories of courage and hope. The Wyoming highway stretched out before Daniel Harris, a seemingly endless ribbon of asphalt that cut through the quiet plains. His truck rumbled beneath him, the steady hum of the tires on the road offering a kind of background noise that made it easier for his mind to drift. It had been weeks since he'd set out on this aimless journey across the country, and still, he hadn't found what he was looking for. Though, if pressed, he wouldn't have been able to say exactly what that was. Peace, maybe, or at least something that felt like it. Since leaving the Marines, Daniel hadn't been able to settle back into civilian life. His discharge had come after years of tours, missions that had taken him to places most people only saw on the news. The intensity of those experiences had left a mark, and though his body had come home in one piece, his mind hadn't quite caught up. Civilian life was quieter, softer. But for Daniel, silence brought its own kind of tension. In the absence of external conflict, he found himself confronting the internal battles he'd avoided for so long. He gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as his eyes scanned the horizon. It was late afternoon, and the sun was already dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the plains. He hadn't seen another car in miles, just the vast, empty landscape stretching out in all directions. It was beautiful in a way, the kind of stark beauty that made a man feel small in the grand scheme of things, but it also amplified the sense of isolation that had been gnawing at him for weeks. Up ahead, a small green sign appeared on the side of the road. Maple Grove Rest Stop, 5 miles. Daniel sighed, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. He hadn't planned to stop, but a break sounded like a good idea. Maybe a cup of coffee, a chance to stretch his legs, anything to break up the monotony of the road. He hadn't spoken to another person in days. As the miles rolled by, the rest stop finally came into view. It was a modest place, just a small diner and a gas station nestled next to a stretch of parking lot that could accommodate a few semis. A line of tall trees bordered the lot, their leaves rustling in the light breeze. The sight of the diner's neon sign flickering in the fading daylight was oddly comforting. A beacon of normalcy in the middle of nowhere. Daniel pulled his truck into the gravel lot and parked near the entrance. He sat there for a moment, staring through the windshield at the diner. Inside, he could see the faint outlines of people, other travelers, truckers maybe, taking a break from the road just like he was. For a moment, he considered just turning the engine back on and driving away, but something stopped him. The need for human connection, however brief, tugged at him. He climbed out of the truck and stretched, the cool evening air a welcome contrast to the stuffy interior of the cab. His boots crunched on the gravel as he made his way toward the diner, his eyes automatically scanning the surroundings. It was a habit he couldn't shake, no matter how long he'd been out of the service. His gaze lingered on the trucks parked at the far end of the lot, then on the lone sedan near the diner's entrance. Nothing seemed out of place, but his mind was always alert, always looking for the unseen threat. He pushed open the door to the diner, a bell chiming softly above his head as he stepped inside. The interior was exactly what he expected: worn vinyl booths, a counter lined with stools, and a small coffee station tucked into the corner. The place smelled of fried food and stale coffee, but it was clean enough, with the kind of charm you only found in small, roadside diners like this. A few people were scattered throughout the spaceman elderly couple at one booth, a pair of truckers hunched over their meals at the counter, and a man reading a newspaper near the window. The waitress behind the counter gave him a brief nod as he walked in, but otherwise no one paid him much attention. Daniel headed for the coffee station, pouring himself a cup of the black liquid. He took a sip, wincing slightly at the bitterness but grateful for the warmth. He hadn't realized how cold it had gotten outside. With his coffee in hand, he made his way to an empty booth near the window, settling into the worn seat with a sigh. He sat there for a few minutes, letting the warmth of the coffee seep into his hands, his eyes drifting out the window to watch the sun slowly sink behind the trees. The quiet of the diner was almost unsettling. He was used to noise, the constant hum of activity that came with being on a military base, the sound of men training, the clatter of equipment. But here, in this small corner of the world, there was only the soft clink of silverware and the low murmur of conversation. It should have been peaceful. But for Daniel, it only served to amplify the restlessness that had been growing inside him. As Daniel sat in the booth, staring out at the darkening sky, his mind began to wander. It was hard not to think about everything he'd left behind, the Marines, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose. Out here on the road, it felt like he was drifting, untethered from everything that had once defined him. He had no clear direction, no mission to complete. Just miles of open road and the nagging feeling that he was running from something, though he couldn't quite figure out what it was. His eyes flicked back to the diner, scanning the room as they had a dozen times since he sat down. It was a habit, one that had been ingrained in him through years of training. Always be aware of your surroundings. Always know who's in the room and where the exits are. Even here, in a quiet diner on the side of the road, he couldn't turn that part of himself off. That's when he saw them. A girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old, sat in a booth near the window on the opposite side of the diner. She was small, her dark skin standing out against the bright red dress she wore. Her curly hair framed her face, and her eyes were wide, darting around the room in a way that immediately caught Daniel's attention. Across from her sat a man, older, maybe in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair neatly combed and a navy suit that looked too crisp for a place like this. He held a newspaper in his hands, though Daniel noticed that he wasn't really reading it. Every so often, the man's eyes would flick over the top of the paper, watching the girl with an intensity that seemed out of place. Something about the pair set Daniel on edge. He watched them for a few moments, his military instincts kicking in as he tried to assess the situation. The man's posture was controlled, almost too controlled, and the way he glanced at the girl made Daniel uneasy. The girl, on the other hand, looked tense. Her small hands fidgeted with the edge of the table, her feet swinging back and forth beneath her seat. She didn't make eye contact with the man, and her eyes never settled on any one thing for too long. Daniel took another sip of his coffee, his eyes narrowing as he continued to observe them. There was a stark contrast between the two, the man's calm, composed demeanor and the girl's clear discomfort. It could have been nothing, he told himself. Maybe they were just an odd pair. Maybe the man was her father or an uncle. Maybe she was just tired from a long day of traveling. But his gut told him otherwise. The more he watched, the more uneasy he felt. The man's gaze was too intense, too calculated. And the girl, there was something in her body language that set off alarm bells in Daniel's mind. She wasn't just tired or shy. She was scared. Daniel set his coffee down, his eyes never leaving the pair. He didn't want to jump to conclusions. This wasn't a battlefield and he wasn't in enemy territory. But years of training had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every fiber of his being was telling him that something was wrong. The girl's hands fidgeted again, this time rising slightly to press against her face as if trying to hide from some unseen threat. Daniel's heart rate picked up, and he had to force himself to stay seated. His instinct was to act, to do something, but he reminded himself that he didn't know the full story. For all he knew, he could be misreading the situation entirely. But then the girl did something that made Daniel's blood run cold. She raised her hand slightly, her palm facing outward, fingers spread wide. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to catch Daniel's attention. He'd seen that kind of gesture before. It was a signal, a silent plea for help. In high-stress situations, when words were too dangerous or too difficult, gestures like that were used to communicate. It was all the confirmation Daniel needed. Daniel's pulse quickened as he watched the girl's hand tremble slightly before she lowered it back to her lap. There was no doubt in his mind now. Something was very wrong. He leaned back in his booth, trying to maintain an air of casual observation, but his mind was already racing through potential scenarios. He had been trained for situations like this to identify threats, to assess and act. But this wasn't a military operation. This was a quiet diner in the middle of nowhere, and the lines between what was appropriate and what was necessary were blurred. The man across from the girl hadn't noticed the gesture, or if he had, he didn't acknowledge it. He continued to flip through his newspaper, his eyes occasionally glancing over the top at the girl, his expression unreadable. But Daniel noticed something else. The way the man's fingers tightened around the edges of the paper, the slight tension in his shoulders. It was subtle, but it was there. Daniel forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't just rush in without knowing more. He needed to be sure, needed to gather as much information as he could before making a move. He took another sip of his coffee, his mind working through the possibilities. Who was this man? What was his relationship to the girl? And why was she so afraid? He thought about approaching them directly, maybe striking up a conversation, but that could spook the man. If this was what Daniel suspected it was, the last thing he wanted was to escalate the situation too quickly. He needed to be smart, to play this carefully. Daniel glanced around the diner, taking stock of the other patrons. The elderly couple in the corner booth seemed oblivious to everything, engrossed in their conversation. The two truckers at the counter were focused on their meals, barely glancing up from their plates. No one else seemed to notice the tension in the air, the silent drama playing out in the corner of the room. He set his coffee cup down and stood, moving toward the vending machines at the back of the diner. From there, he could keep an eye on the pair without drawing too much attention to himself. As he leaned against the wall, pretending to decide between snacks, his eyes remained locked on the man and the girl. The girl's behavior hadn't changed. She was still fidgeting, her hands moving restlessly in her lap, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for a way out. Every so often, she would glance up at the man and then quickly avert her gaze when she saw him watching her. Daniel's gut churned. He had seen this kind of fear before in civilians caught in the crossfire, in children who had lived through war. It was the kind of fear that left a mark that made a person shrink into themselves, trying to disappear. The man, on the other hand, was too calm. His movements were measured, controlled. He flipped through the pages of his newspaper with an air of casual indifference, but Daniel could see through the act. The man was watching the girl closely, his gaze lingering on her just a little too long, his posture just a little too tense. Daniel's mind raced. He needed to make a decision. Every instinct was telling him to act, to intervene before something happened. But what if he was wrong? What if this was just a misunderstanding? A case of an overprotective father and a shy daughter? He thought about calling the police, but what would he say? That he had a bad feeling? That he had seen a hand gesture that might or might not have been a distress signal? He needed more than that. He needed something concrete. The girl's hand rose again, the same small, subtle gesture, palm out, fingers spread. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. It was deliberate. She was asking for help. He couldn't wait any longer. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to calm the adrenaline that was already surging through his veins. He couldn't afford to make a mistake, couldn't afford to misread the situation. He stepped away from the vending machines, moving slowly toward the exit of the diner. He needed to make a call, needed to get outside where he could think clearly and figure out his next move. As he pushed open the door and stepped into the cool evening air, his mind raced through the options. He could call the police, report what he had seen, and hope they arrived in time to intervene. But what if the man left before they got here? What if Daniel had already waited too long? His hand shook slightly as he pulled his phone from his pocket. The temptation to rush back inside and confront the man was strong, but he knew that could backfire. The man was bigger than the girl, stronger. If Daniel approached him directly, there was no telling how he might react. And the girl, he didn't want to put her in more danger than she was already in. He dialed 911, his breath coming in shallow bursts as he held the phone to his ear. 911, what's your emergency? Daniel hesitated for only a second before speaking. I'm at the Maple Grove rest stop, just off Highway 27. There's a girl here, and I think she's in danger. The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. Can you describe the situation? Daniel quickly recounted what he had seen, the girl's fearful behavior, the man's controlling demeanor, and the possible distress signal. He tried to keep his voice steady, but the urgency in his tone was unmistakable. We'll send officers to your location immediately, the dispatcher said. Please stay on the line and don't intervene unless the child is in immediate danger. Daniel nodded, though the dispatcher couldn't see him. Okay, he muttered, his mind already racing ahead. He couldn't just wait here. If the man tried to leave, Daniel needed to be ready. He ended the call and turned back toward the diner. Through the window, he saw the man shift in his seat, his hand reaching for the newspaper again. The girl remained still, her body tense, her eyes still darting around the room. Daniel moved closer to the diner, positioning himself near the door. He was ready to act if the situation escalated, but for now, he needed to wait. The police were on their way, and he had to trust that they would arrive on time. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched the scene unfold inside. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that if he didn't do something soon, the opportunity to help the girl would slip through his fingers. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching out longer than the last. Daniel's pulse quickened with every passing second, his mind racing through the possibilities. What if the man noticed him watching? What if he tried to leave with the girl before the police arrived? And then, just as Daniel's patience was wearing thin, the man stood. He grabbed the girl's arm, his grip firm but not overtly aggressive, and began pulling her toward the exit. The girl's eyes widened in fear, her small body tensing as she stumbled to her feet. Daniel's heart leapt into his throat. He couldn't wait any longer. Daniel's mind raced as he watched the man, Frank he now guessed, pull the little girl toward the exit. His grip on her arm was too tight, too urgent, and the panic in the girl's wide eyes confirmed Daniel's worst fears. This was no family outing. This man was planning to leave with her, and if Daniel didn't do something now, it could be the last chance anyone had to stop him. For a split second, Daniel considered rushing in, confronting Frank directly. But he knew that without backup, it could escalate quickly. The girl could get hurt in the process. He needed to think clearly, to act with the precision he had been trained for. He took a step toward the diner's entrance, ready to intervene, when the wail of sirens cut through the tension like a knife. 2 police cars screeched into the parking lot. their flashing lights casting an eerie red and blue glow across the gravel. Frank froze in place, his hand still gripping the girl's arm. His head whipped around toward the sound of the approaching police, and for a moment, Daniel could see the panic flicker across his face. His carefully controlled composure shattered as the reality of the situation hit him. The police were here. Frank's grip tightened on the girl, but before he could make a move, Daniel stepped forward, putting himself between Frank and the door. "Let her go," Daniel said, his voice low but firm. His body tensed, every muscle ready for what might come next. Frank hesitated, his eyes flicking between Daniel and the police cars pulling into the lot. He seemed to be weighing his options, calculating his next move. But Daniel could see the fear in his eyes, the realization that his plan was unraveling right in front of him. Two officers emerged from patrol cars, their hands resting on their holsters as they approached the diner. One of them, a tall man with sharp features, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Frank plastered a strained smile on his face, his hand still gripping the girl's arm. "Officer, there's no problem. This is my niece, and we're just on our way out." The officer's gaze shifted to the girl, who stood frozen in place, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't say anything, but her body language told the whole story. Her small hands were clenched into fists at her sides, her shoulders hunched as though she were trying to make herself disappear. The second officer, a woman with a kind but firm expression, moved closer, crouching down to the girl's level. "Sweetie, are you okay?" she asked softly. "Do you know this man?" The girl's lips trembled, and for a moment, Daniel thought she might stay silent, too scared to speak. But then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I don't want to go with him." The room seemed to freeze. Frank's smile faltered, and Daniel could see the panic creeping back into his eyes. He started to pull the girl closer to him, his voice rising in desperation. "She's just tired, officer. She's been through a lot lately. You know how kids get." But the officers weren't buying it. The male officer stepped forward, placing himself between Frank and the girl, his posture calm but commanding. "Sir, I'm going to need you to let go of her and step aside so we can talk to the child." Frank's composure cracked. His grip on the girl tightened, and for a brief, terrifying moment, Daniel thought he might try to make a run for it, dragging the girl with him. But before Frank could take another step, the female officer moved in, gently but firmly placing a hand on the girl's shoulder and guiding her away from Frank. "Come with me, sweetheart," she said, her voice soothing. "You're safe now." As soon as the girl was out of Frank's reach, his mask of control shattered completely. His face twisted with anger, and he took a step toward the officers, his hands clenched into fists. "You don't understand," he growled. "I'm her family. You have no right." But the male officer was ready. In one smooth motion, he reached for his handcuffs and grabbed Frank's arm, twisting it behind his back before he had a chance to react. "Sir, you're under arrest for attempted abduction." Frank struggled against the officer's grip, shouting incoherently, but it was no use. Within seconds, he was cuffed and being led toward the police car. His protests grew louder, but the officers ignored him, their focus now on ensuring the girl's safety. Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his body relaxing for the first time since he'd stepped into the diner. The immediate danger was over, but his heart still pounded in his chest, the adrenaline from the confrontation slowly fading. Daniel stood by the door, watching as the female officer knelt beside the girl, speaking to her in soft, reassuring tones. The girl's small body trembled, and her wide eyes darted between the officer and Frank, who was now being pushed into the back of the police car. Even though Frank was in custody, the girl still looked terrified, as if she couldn't quite believe that it was over. Daniel's chest tightened as he watched her. He had seen fear like that before, fear that didn't go away just because the immediate threat had been removed. It was the kind of fear that lingered, the kind that made you question everything you thought you knew about safety. The male officer approached Daniel, his expression one of calm professionalism. "You were the one who called this in?" he asked, pulling out a small notepad. Daniel nodded, his voice hoarse from the tension. "Yeah, I saw something wasn't right." The officer gave him an approving nod. "Good instincts. You did the right thing. Too many people would have looked the other way." Daniel forced a small smile, but inside, he felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him. Had he really done the right thing? He had been trained to act in high-pressure situations, to make decisions quickly and decisively, but this wasn't the battlefield. This was the real world, and here, the consequences of making a mistake felt far more personal. As the officer took down Daniel's information and asked a few more questions about what he had witnessed, Daniel's mind drifted back to the girl. She was sitting on one of the diner's booths now, her knees pulled up to her chest, her small hands wrapped tightly around her legs. The female officer was still talking to her, but Daniel could see that the girl hadn't said much. She just stared down at the table, her face pale and drawn. "Hey," the male officer said, drawing Daniel's attention back. "We're going to need you to stick around for a bit longer, just until we've sorted everything out." "Sure," Daniel replied, though his thoughts were still on the girl. The officer gave him another nod before walking over to join his partner, leaving Daniel standing near the entrance, unsure of what to do next. He had done his part. The police had taken control of the situation. So why did he feel like he couldn't just leave? Maybe it was because he knew what came next for the girl. The trauma, the nightmares, the long road to recovery. He had seen it before, in war zones, and in the faces of civilians who had survived the worst humanity had to offer. And he knew that even though the immediate danger was over, the psychological wounds would take much longer to heal. He watched as the female officer finally stood, placing a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "We're going to take you to the station, okay? Your dad's on his way." The girl nodded, her eyes still focused on the floor. She hadn't spoken a word since the initial confrontation, and Daniel suspected that it would take a while before she felt safe enough to talk about what had happened. As the officers began to escort the girl out of the diner, Daniel felt a strange pull. He couldn't just walk away. Not yet. Without really knowing why, he followed them outside, watching as they guided the girl into the back of the patrol car. She glanced back toward the diner one last time, her eyes meeting Daniel's for the briefest of moments. There was something in her gaze, something that looked a lot like gratitude. As the police car drove away, Daniel stood in the parking lot, watching the taillights disappear into the distance. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation was gone now, leaving him feeling strangely hollow. He had done what needed to be done, but the emotional weight of it all hadn't fully hit him until now. The image of the girl's frightened face lingered in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that, in some way, this wasn't over for him either. Sure, the police would handle the legal side of things, and the girl would be reunited with her father, but something about this whole situation had struck a chord deep within him. He remembered the way she had looked at him before the police car pulled away. That fleeting moment of connection, of understanding, had stirred something inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. For weeks he had been driving across the country, aimless, trying to find meaning in the life he had left behind. His time in the Marines had been defined by clear objectives, by missions that required action and decisiveness. But out here in the real world, everything felt so much more uncertain. There were no orders to follow, no enemies to fight, just an overwhelming sense of drifting. But tonight, for the first time since leaving the service, Daniel had felt that spark of purpose again. In that diner, when he had seen the girl's silent plea for help, he hadn't hesitated. His instincts had kicked in, and he had done what he was trained to do, protect the vulnerable. The realization hit him like a wave, crashing over him with a force he hadn't expected. Maybe he wasn't as lost as he thought. Maybe there was still a place for him in this world, even if it wasn't on the battlefield. The sound of footsteps approaching snapped Daniel out of his thoughts. He turned to see one of the officers, the woman who had spoken to the girl, walking toward him. "Hey," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I just wanted to thank you again for stepping in. We don't always get people who are willing to act when they see something wrong." Daniel shrugged, still unsure how to respond to the praise. "I just did what anyone else would have done." The officer smiled, though there was a knowing look in her eyes. "Not everyone has the instincts to recognize danger the way you did. You probably saved that girl's life tonight." Daniel nodded, though the weight of her words felt heavy on his shoulders. He wasn't used to being called a hero. In the military, actions like this were expected, part of the job. But out here, it felt different, more personal. The officer gave him a small nod before turning to head back toward her car. As she left, Daniel stood there for a few more moments, staring at the spot where the police cars had been parked. The night was quiet now, the air cools against his skin. The diner behind him was still bustling with activity, but for Daniel the world had slowed to a crawl. He took a deep breath, trying to clear his mind. He had done his part. The girl was safe. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something. The next morning, Daniel woke up in a cheap motel room just off the highway, the events of the previous night playing over and over in his mind. He had finally managed to fall asleep after hours of tossing and turning, his thoughts consumed by the little girl and the man who had tried to take her. Frank. The name had stuck with him, even though he didn't know much about the man beyond his appearance and the fear he had instilled in the girl. After leaving the diner, Daniel had driven aimlessly for a while, trying to shake off the lingering tension from the confrontation. But no matter how far he drove, he couldn't escape the weight of it. Eventually, he had pulled into the nearest motel and checked in, too exhausted to keep going. Now, as he sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the morning light filtering through the thin curtains, Daniel knew that he couldn't just move on from this, not yet. His phone buzzed on the nightstand and he reached for it, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the number on the screen. It was the police. "Hello?" he answered, his voice still rough from sleep. "Mr. Harris, this is Officer Cooper. I just wanted to give you an update on the case." Daniel sat up straighter, his mind immediately snapping into focus. "What's going on?" "We've taken Frank into custody, and after questioning, it's clear that this was an attempted abduction. The girl's father, James Brooks, is on his way to pick her up now. There's going to be a formal investigation, but it looks like her mother and Frank were planning to take her out of the country." Daniel's stomach dropped at the thought. He had known something was wrong, but hearing the full extent of what Frank had been planning made it all the more real. If he hadn't intervened, if the police hadn't arrived in time. The officer's voice softened. "I just wanted to let you know that the girl is safe thanks to you. Her father is grateful for what you did, and I'm sure he'd want to thank you personally." Daniel nodded, though the relief that washed over him was tinged with something else, an unsettling sense of how close they had come to losing her. "Thanks for the update," he said quietly. "I appreciate it." After the call ended, Daniel sat there for a long time, staring at the phone in his hand. The case was far from over, but for now at least, the girl was safe. He had done his part, and yet, as he thought about the road ahead for the little girl and her father, Daniel knew that there was more to this story than just one night at a diner. There were legal battles to be fought, emotional scars to be healed, and a future to be rebuilt. And somehow, in a way he couldn't quite explain, Daniel felt connected to that future. Daniel leaned back in the uncomfortable chair in the corner of the police station, the sound of phones ringing and officers shuffling paperwork, creating a steady hum in the background. He had been here for almost an hour, waiting to give a more detailed statement about what had happened at the diner the night before. Even though the immediate threat was over, he still felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the adrenaline from the confrontation long gone, replaced by a deep, gnawing exhaustion. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting a harsh, artificial glow over the room. Everything felt surreal, as though Daniel were watching himself from the outside, detached from the world around him. He'd been in tense situations before, but this one felt different, more personal. The image of the girl's terrified face wouldn't leave his mind, and the thought of what might have happened if he hadn't intervened churned in his gut like a storm he couldn't calm. Across the room, Daniel spotted the officer he had spoken to the night before, Officer Cooper, walking toward him. Cooper's expression was serious, but there was a hint of relief in his eyes. "Daniel," Cooper said, nodding as he sat down across from him. "Thanks for waiting. I know this has been a long night." Daniel nodded, though he wasn't sure what to say. "Is the girl okay?" he asked. His voice was rough with fatigue. Cooper sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "She's fine, physically at least. Her father, James Brooks, arrived a couple of hours ago. They're with a child specialist now, working through the next steps. The good news is that Frank's in custody and we've got enough to hold him. But this is far from over." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Cooper leaned forward, his voice lowering as he explained. "It turns out this wasn't just some spur-of-the-moment abduction. Frank's been planning this for weeks, maybe months. The girl's mother, Tina Brooks, has been in a custody battle with her ex-husband, and when she lost custody, she and Frank started plotting to take the girl and flee the country." Daniel's stomach twisted as Cooper continued. "We found plane tickets in Frank's car, along with a fake passport for the girl. They were planning to take her out of the country before the court could enforce the custody ruling." Daniel felt a wave of nausea roll through him. The situation had been worse than he'd imagined. If he hadn't stepped in, if the police hadn't arrived in time, the girl might have disappeared, taken to another country where her father might never have found her. "They were really going to take her?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Cooper nodded grimly. "It looks that way, and the worst part is, her mother was in on it. She's been working with Frank this whole time, trying to get her daughter away from her ex-husband. She convinced the school that Frank had permission to pick the girl up, and from there, they planned to head straight to the airport." Daniel clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he struggled to process what Cooper was telling him. He had known something was wrong, but hearing the full scope of the plan made it all feel so much more dangerous. He could picture it now. The girl, trapped in some foreign country, cut off from the only family who truly cared about her. "They would have gotten away with it," Cooper said quietly, "if you hadn't been there." Daniel shook his head, still trying to wrap his mind around the reality of what had almost happened. I just did what felt right. I couldn't ignore it." "And thank God for that," Cooper replied, his tone firm. "Most people wouldn't have noticed. They would have looked the other way, convinced themselves it was nothing." Daniel looked down at his hands, the weight of Cooper's words pressing down on him. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt very tired, drained. "What happens now?" Daniel asked after a long pause. "We're building a case against both Frank and Tina," Cooper explained. "It's going to take time, but with the evidence we've found and your testimony, We're confident we can get a conviction. The girl's father has full custody now, so she'll be safe with him." Daniel nodded slowly, though the tight knot in his chest hadn't loosened. "I'm glad she's safe." Cooper stood, giving Daniel a small nod of appreciation. "We're grateful for what you did. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." As Cooper walked away, Daniel leaned back in his chair again, his mind racing. He had done the right thing. The girl was safe. But somehow, that didn't feel like enough. The thought of how close she had come to being taken haunted him, and no matter how many times he told himself that it was over, that he had done everything he could, the nagging feeling of uncertainty refused to let go. He closed his eyes, trying to push the thoughts away, but sleep didn't come. 2 days later, Daniel received a call he hadn't been expecting. He was sitting in a small diner a few miles outside of town, nursing a cup of coffee and trying to shake the heavy feeling that had settled over him since the night of the incident. He hadn't been able to stop thinking about the girl, about Lily, and the fact that her life had been so close to being irrevocably changed. He had been wrestling with the guilt of what might have happened if he hadn't acted fast enough, and no matter how much time passed, the weight of that responsibility refused to lift. When his phone buzzed, Daniel hesitated before answering, half expecting it to be another follow-up from the police, but the number on the screen was unfamiliar. "Hello?" he said, his voice tired. "Daniel Harris?" a man's voice asked. "Yeah, who's this?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before the man spoke again, his voice heavy with emotion. "This is James Brooks. I'm Lily's father." Daniel sat up straighter in his seat, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. "James, hi, is everything okay?" James's voice cracked slightly as he replied, I wanted to thank you for what you did for my daughter. I don't even know how to put into words how grateful I am." Daniel's throat tightened. He had been expecting some kind of follow-up, but hearing James's voice, hearing the raw emotion in it, brought everything back in full force. "You don't have to thank me," Daniel said quietly. "I just did what anyone would have done." James let out a shaky breath. "No, not anyone. Most people wouldn't have seen what you saw. Most people wouldn't have acted. You saved my little girl, and because of that, I owe you more than I can ever repay." Daniel didn't know how to respond. He had never been comfortable with praise, especially when it came to situations like this. He had been trained to act in the face of danger, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. But out here, in the civilian world, it felt different, more real, more personal. "I'm just glad she's okay," Daniel said finally. She's doing better," James replied, though his voice still held a note of uncertainty. "It's going to take time, but she's safe now, and that's what matters." There was another pause, and Daniel could sense that James wanted to say more. "Listen," James said after a moment, his voice is a bit stronger now. "I know this is a lot to ask, but Lily, she's been asking about you. She wants to meet the man who saved her." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't been expecting that. "She wants to meet me?" "Yeah," James said softly. I think it would mean a lot to her. She's been through so much, and I think seeing you might help her process it, help her understand that she's really safe now." Daniel wasn't sure what to say. Part of him wanted to agree, to meet Lily and make sure she was really okay. But another part of him, the part that still carried the weight of his own guilt and doubt, wasn't sure if he was ready for that kind of responsibility. But how could he say no? "I'd be honored to meet her," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. James sounded relieved. "Thank you. I can't tell you how much this means to us." They made plans to meet at a park near James's home the following afternoon, And after hanging up, Daniel sat in the diner staring out the window at the passing cars. He couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting was about more than just closure for Lily. It was about finding closure for himself, too. The park was quiet when Daniel arrived the next day. The soft rustle of the wind through the trees, creating a peaceful backdrop to what he knew would be an emotionally charged meeting. As he parked his truck and stepped out onto the grass, Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure what to expect, what Lily would be like, how she would react to seeing him. All he knew was that this felt important, like the final piece of a puzzle he hadn't realized he'd been trying to solve. As he walked toward the playground, he spotted James sitting on a bench, his arm draped protectively around Lily's small shoulders. The little girl was holding a stuffed animal, a worn teddy bear that looked like it had been through as much as she had. Her face was turned toward the ground, her dark curls falling over her eyes as she clutched the bear tightly. James saw Daniel first, his expression softening as he stood and waved him over. "Daniel, thanks for coming." Daniel nodded, his eyes flicking to Lily, who still hadn't looked up. "Of course." James knelt down beside Lily, gently brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "Sweetheart, this is Daniel, the man I told you about, the one who helped you at the diner." Lily glanced up hesitantly, her wide eyes meeting Daniel's for the first time. There was a flicker of recognition in her gaze, and for a moment she just stared at him as if trying to piece together everything her father had told her. Daniel smiled gently, though his heart ached at the sight of her. "Hi, Lily," he said softly. "It's nice to meet you." Lily didn't say anything at first, but then, slowly, she stood up from the bench, still clutching her teddy bear. She took a step toward Daniel, her small hands trembling slightly. And then, in a quiet, shaky voice, she said, "Thank you." Daniel felt his throat tighten, and for a moment he couldn't find the words to respond. This was the girl he had seen in the diner, the girl who had been so afraid, so small and vulnerable. But now, standing in front of him, she seemed stronger, braver. "You're welcome," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're very brave, Lily." Lily's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but she smiled. Just a small, tentative smile, but it was enough to break through the wall of fear that had surrounded her for so long. James stood nearby, watching the exchange with a mixture of pride and gratitude. "She's been asking about you ever since I told her what happened," James said quietly. "I think she needed to know that the person who helped her was real, that it wasn't just a story." Daniel nodded, understanding exactly what James meant. In situations like this, it was easy for reality to blur with fear, for memories to become tangled with emotions. Meeting Daniel, seeing him in person, was a way for Lily to ground herself in the fact that she was truly safe. Lily stepped closer to Daniel, her small hand reaching out to touch the sleeve of his jacket. "Are you a hero?" she asked, her voice so soft that Daniel almost didn't hear it. Daniel crouched down, so he was at eye level with her, shaking his head gently. "No, I'm not a hero," he said. "I just wanted to help. That's all." Lily seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding, as if she accepted his answer. She took another step forward and wrapped her small arms around his neck, hugging him tightly. Daniel froze for a moment, caught off guard by the gesture, but then he returned the hug, his arms gentle but protective around her. As they stood there, the weight of the past few days seemed to lift, if only for a moment. Lily was safe. And for the first time since the night at the diner, Daniel felt a sense of peace. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of soft conversations and quiet moments. Daniel, James, and Lily sat on the bench, watching as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park. They didn't talk much about what had happened at the diner. There was no need. Instead, they focused on the present, on the small, fragile moments of normalcy that had been so hard-won. At one point, Lily wandered off to play on the swings, her laughter ringing out across the park as she kicked her legs and soared higher into the air. Watching her, Daniel felt a deep sense of relief. This was what he had fought for, this moment of happiness, of safety. James leaned back on the bench, his eyes following his daughter as she played. "It's going to take time for her to heal," he said quietly, his voice laced with both hope and uncertainty. "But I think she's going to be okay." Daniel nodded. "She's strong," he said, glancing over at James. "She's got you, and that makes all the difference." James smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "I just wish things hadn't come to this, that her mother, that Tina hadn't—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought, but Daniel knew what he was thinking. It was hard to reconcile the idea that someone who was supposed to love and protect Lily could have been complicit in something so terrible. But the reality was that Tina had made her choice, and now it was up to James to pick up the pieces. "She's got a good father," Daniel said, his voice steady. "That's what matters now." James nodded, though his eyes were filled with the weight of everything they had been through. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure she's safe," he said quietly, "no matter what it takes." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Lily ran back over to the bench, her face flushed with excitement. "Daddy, look," she called, holding up a small flower she had picked from the grass. James smiled, pulling her into his lap as she showed him the flower. For a moment, it was as if nothing bad had ever happened, as if this was just a normal day, with a father and daughter enjoying the simple pleasures of life. Daniel stood, stretching his legs as he prepared to leave. He had done what he came to do. Lily was safe, and James was by her side, ready to guide her through the difficult road ahead. "Thank you," James said again, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything." Daniel smiled, feeling a sense of closure that he hadn't expected. "You don't have to thank me," he replied. "I'm just glad she's okay." As he walked away, heading back to his truck, Daniel felt something shift inside him. The weight that had been pressing down on him for so long, the uncertainty, the guilt, had finally begun to lift. He had found his purpose again. Not on a battlefield, but here, in quiet moments, where real lives were saved by small acts of courage and instinct. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt at peace. The drive back to the small motel felt different this time. As Daniel navigated the quiet streets, the sun casting long shadows across the landscape, he realized the tension that had gripped him for the past few days had finally begun to dissipate. His mind no longer raced with the what-ifs that had haunted him since the incident at the diner. Instead, his thoughts were steady, focused on the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had made a difference in a young girl's life. The world outside seemed more peaceful now, as though the weight of his internal turmoil had finally been lifted. He no longer felt the need to keep moving, to search for something just beyond his grasp. The ache that had driven him on this aimless journey across the country had quieted. He was still a man searching for meaning, but after meeting Lily, after seeing her smile and laugh again, he knew he was on the right path. When he pulled into the motel parking lot, Daniel turned off the engine and sat in the silence for a moment. He thought about Lily and how resilient she had been despite everything she'd gone through. And he thought about James, a father who had nearly lost his daughter, but now had a second chance to build a better life for her. It wasn't just about the physical safety that had been restored. It was about emotional security, the sense that life, however imperfect, was still worth fighting for. As Daniel stepped out of his truck, he took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill his lungs. It felt like the start of something new, a chapter in his life where the need for action and vigilance would serve a different purpose, a purpose than survival. He had always been a protector, but now he saw that the people who needed protection weren't just those in war zones. They were all around him, in the quiet moments of everyday life. That night, as he lay in the stiff motel bed, sleep came easier than it had in a long time. The next morning, Daniel woke up feeling a strange sense of clarity. He had spent so long searching for something to give his life meaning again, but the answer had been right in front of him the whole time. His instincts, honed by years of military service, were still sharp. But more importantly, they were needed. As he sipped his coffee, he thought about the conversations he'd had with James and Lily. Seeing them rebuild their lives in the aftermath of such trauma had stirred something in Daniel. It wasn't just about saving them from danger, it was about giving them hope and security for the future. And that was something he knew he could help others find too. The more Daniel thought about it, the more he realized that his skills could be used to help people like Lily, people who were vulnerable, whose voices weren't always heard. There were organizations, both local and national, that worked with children in danger, with families struggling through the legal system, or with people in abusive situations. He didn't know exactly what form it would take yet, but Daniel knew he wanted to be a part of that. Maybe he could volunteer, or maybe even take on a more formal role in child protection or advocacy. He could use what he knew to help others see the signs of danger, to act before it was too late. There was a sense of satisfaction in this realization, a quiet confidence that came from knowing he had found a new direction. He didn't need to be in uniform to protect people. He didn't need orders from a commanding officer to make a difference. He could choose this path for himself, on his own terms. The rest of the day passed in a blur as Daniel researched different organizations that aligned with his new sense of purpose. He found several groups dedicated to child advocacy, helping families navigate difficult custody battles, and even providing security and training for parents dealing with dangerous situations. The more he learned, the more motivated he became. This wasn't just about finding a job or filling his time. It was about finding a way to use everything he had learned in the military to help people who needed it the most. By the time the sun began to set, Daniel had already drafted an email to a local child advocacy group. He wasn't sure where this journey would take him, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a deep sense of peace about the road ahead. The days passed quickly, and soon Daniel found himself driving back to James's house for one final visit. The barbecue invitation had been extended again, this time with a promise of more closure. James had hinted that there was more to tell about Tina, about what had led to the desperate attempt to take Lily from him. Daniel had agreed, knowing that these conversations would provide the last pieces of a puzzle he had been assembling since that fateful night. When Daniel arrived at the Brooks house, the sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light over the backyard. The smell of grilling food filled the air, and laughter drifted from where Lily and a few other children were playing near the porch. It was a scene of pure normalcy, the kind of quiet, peaceful life that had seemed so far out of reach just weeks ago. James greeted Daniel with a firm handshake and a smile, though there was a seriousness in his eyes that told Daniel this wouldn't just be a casual gathering. There was still much to be discussed. "Thanks for coming, Daniel," James said, guiding him toward the grill. "Lily's been asking about you. I think seeing you has really helped her process everything." "I'm glad," Daniel replied, glancing toward Lily, who was running around with the other kids, her laughter bright and free. "She seems happy." James nodded, but his expression grew more serious as they moved to a quieter corner of the yard. "She is," he said, "but it's been a long road, and there's still a lot of healing to do." They sat down at a small table, and James poured them both a glass of lemonade. For a few moments they sat in silence, watching the kids play. The soft clink of glasses is the only sound between them. Finally, James spoke. "I wanted to tell you about Tina, about what led to all of this. I think it's important that you understand the full story." Daniel nodded, already sensing that this was something James had needed to say for a while. "I'm listening." James took a deep breath, his eyes distant as he began to speak. "Tina and I were happy once. When Lily was born, things were good. But over time, things changed. Tina started pulling away. She became distant, paranoid. At first, I thought it was just the stress of being a new parent, but it was more than that." He paused, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "She started talking about taking Lily away, said she didn't trust the world, didn't trust me to protect her. At first, I didn't take it seriously. I thought she was just scared that maybe she needed help. But as time went on, it became clear that she wasn't thinking rationally anymore. She wanted to isolate Lily from everything, from everyone." Daniel listened quietly, his heart aching as he imagined the turmoil James must have gone through, watching the woman he loved spiral into fear and delusion. "I tried to get her help," James continued, "but she wouldn't accept it. She started making threats, saying that if I didn't agree to leave with her, she'd take Lily and disappear. I didn't believe her at first, but then I started finding plane tickets, documents, plans." He looked at Daniel, his eyes filled with the weight of everything he had been holding inside. "I filed for custody because I knew I had no other choice, but when the court ruled in my favor, I knew she wouldn't just let it go. I just didn't realize how far she would go to take Lily from me." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine as James's words sank in. This hadn't just been a moment of desperation. It had been a calculated plan, months in the making. "I didn't want it to end like this," James said softly. "I wanted to help her, I still do. But I had to protect Lily." Daniel nodded, understanding the painful choice James had been forced to make. "You did the right thing. You protected your daughter. That's what matters." James looked down at the table, his expression somber. "I just wish it hadn't come to this." They sat in silence for a few more moments before James looked up again, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. "But Lily's safe now, and that's because of you." Daniel shook his head, feeling the familiar discomfort that came with being called a hero. "I just did what needed to be done." "You saved her life," James said firmly. "Don't ever forget that." Before Daniel could respond, Lily came running over, her face flushed with excitement. "Daddy! Daniel! Look what I can do!" She held up a small yellow ball and tossed it into the air, catching it with a triumphant grin. Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with pride and relief at the sight of her so happy, so free. "Good job, Lily," he called, watching as she ran back to join the other kids. James chuckled softly. "She's going to be okay," he said quietly. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, she is." As the evening wore on and the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the backyard, Daniel felt a sense of peace settling over him. The laughter of children, the clink of glasses, and the hum of quiet conversation filled the air, creating a sense of normalcy that was all the more precious given the turmoil that had preceded it. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt like he belonged somewhere. He wasn't just a drifter, searching for meaning on an endless road. He had found a purpose, not just in protecting people, but in being a part of something larger than himself. A family, even if it wasn't his own. As he said his goodbyes to James and Lily, Daniel felt a deep sense of closure. He had come full circle, from the moment of tension and fear at the diner to this peaceful, quiet evening in the backyard. He had found his place again, not as a soldier, but as someone who could still make a difference in the lives of others. As he drove away from the Brooks house, the headlights cutting through the darkness, Daniel knew that his journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead, more people to protect, more battles to fight. But for now, he felt at peace, knowing that he had made the right choices, knowing that Lily was safe. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The Wyoming highway stretched endlessly before Daniel Harris, a narrow ribbon of asphalt winding its way through vast fields of nothing. On either side of the road, open plains stretched for miles, the sparse grasslands swaying gently in the cool wind of late afternoon. Above him the sky was a pale wash of blue, dotted here and there with drifting clouds. The endless monotony should have been peaceful, maybe even comforting, but for Daniel, it only seemed to heighten the gnawing sense of emptiness that had settled deep inside him. His truck rumbled beneath him, a sturdy old Ford that had seen better days but was still dependable enough to get him from one nameless town to the next. The hum of the engine was a constant soothing noise, one that let his mind wander without fully tuning out the world around him. He had been on the road for weeks now, though he wasn't sure where he was going, if there was even a destination at all. He glanced at the worn leather seat beside him where a stack of old road maps lay haphazardly, edges curled from use. None of them were marked with a specific route. He just drove, picking highways at random, moving from town to town, never staying long enough for anyone to notice. This wasn't about sightseeing or adventure. It was about escaping. Or maybe it was about searching. Daniel still wasn't sure which one. He didn't think too much about the why. It was easier that way. Since he left the Marines, civilian life had been, well, calling it an adjustment would be an understatement. The military had given him structure, purpose, a sense of belonging. Out here on the open road, without orders or a mission to complete, everything felt unmoored. He was drifting. And the longer he drifted, the more he questioned whether he had left something behind on that last tour that he could never get back. It wasn't just the camaraderie or the action he missed. It was the clarity of it all, the simplicity of knowing exactly what needed to be done and when. The road stretched ahead of him, long and straight, cutting through the Wyoming landscape with no sign of civilization for miles. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the plains. It was the kind of scenery that would make for a beautiful postcard, but Daniel hardly noticed. He was too busy staring out the windshield, his mind a jumble of thoughts, none of them leading anywhere. A green sign appeared on the side of the highway, its lettering slightly faded from years of exposure to the elements. Maple Grove Rest Stop, 5 miles. Daniel sighed, glancing at the clock on his dashboard. It was getting late. The sun would be setting soon, and the idea of pulling over, getting out of the truck, and stretching his legs for a few minutes sounded appealing. He could use a cup of coffee, too, something to warm him up after hours on the road. He hadn't spoken to another person in 3 days. As the miles ticked by, the rest stop slowly came into view. It was a small place, barely a dot on the map, nestled against a backdrop of tall trees that lined the highway. A modest diner sat in the middle of the parking lot, next to a gas station with a single pump. It looked like the kind of place where truckers stopped to refuel and grab a quick meal before continuing on their long, lonely journeys. Daniel pulled into the gravel parking lot and eased his truck into a space near the entrance. The lot was nearly empty, save for a couple of big rigs parked at the far end, their drivers probably inside grabbing a bite to eat. He sat in the cab for a moment, staring through the windshield at the diner. The neon sign in the window flickered faintly, casting a soft orange glow that promised warmth and comfort, at least for a little while. Finally, he shut off the engine, stepped out of the truck, and stretched. The cool evening air hit him like a breath of fresh relief after the staleness of the cab. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the tension ease slightly as he stretched his arms above his head. His boots crunched on the gravel as he made his way toward the diner, his eyes scanning the surroundings out of habit more than anything else. Even after all this time, the instincts ingrained by years of military service refused to fade. As he approached the door, he caught sight of his reflection in the glass. He looked older than he remembered, his dark hair flecked with gray at the temples, lines etched into his face from years of stress and hard living. His eyes, once sharp and focused, now seemed distant, like they were always searching for something just out of reach. With a heavy sigh, Daniel pushed open the door and stepped inside. The diner was a picture of quiet, small-town Americana. Faded vinyl booths lined the walls, their colors muted by years of use, while a long counter stretched across the middle of the room, flanked by metal stools with cracked leather seats. The smell of fried food and old coffee hung in the air, a familiar, comforting scent that reminded Daniel of the diners he had stopped at during long road trips in his younger years. There were only a handful of people inside, a couple of truckers hunched over their meals at the counter, a waitress pouring coffee into chipped mugs, and an elderly couple quietly chatting in the corner booth. It was the kind of place where nothing much happened, where the hours passed slowly and uneventfully. Or so it seemed. As Daniel made his way to the coffee station, a figure near the window caught his eye. A young girl, no more than 8 years old, sat in one of the booths, her dark skin a sharp contrast against the bright red dress she wore. Her hair was curly, framing a small face that looked far too serious for someone her age. Across from her sat a man, older, maybe in his 50s, dressed in a neat navy blue suit that looked strangely out of place in the casual diner. Something about them didn't sit right with Daniel. He poured himself a cup of coffee, his gaze flicking back to the pair by the window. The man had a newspaper open in front of him, but Daniel noticed that he wasn't really reading it. Every so often, the man's eyes would glance over the top of the paper, watching the girl with an intensity that made Daniel's skin crawl. The girl, for her part, seemed uncomfortable. She fidgeted with the edge of the table, her hands constantly moving as if she didn't know what to do with them. Her feet swung under the booth, never quite touching the ground, and every so often she would glance up at the man before quickly looking away. Daniel took a slow sip of his coffee, his mind already starting to work through the situation. The girl didn't look like she was related to the man. Maybe she was adopted. Or perhaps a family friend's child. There could have been a perfectly innocent explanation for the scene he was watching, but something about it felt off. His instincts, honed by years of training, were screaming at him that something wasn't right. He set his coffee down and leaned against the counter, keeping his eyes on the pair by the window. The man's posture was too controlled, too stiff, as though he were trying to appear calm but failing to hide the tension coiled just beneath the surface. The girl's wide eyes darted around the room, never settling on any one thing for too long. She seemed skittish, nervous, like she was waiting for something bad to happen. Daniel had seen that look before. He watched as the girl's small hands fidgeted in her lap, her fingers drumming an anxious rhythm on the edge of the table. Every so often she would bring her hand up to her face, pressing her fingers against her lips as though trying to stifle a cry or hide her fear. The man noticed. His eyes flicked over the top of the newspaper, narrowing slightly as he watched the girl. Daniel couldn't hear what they were saying, if they were saying anything at all, but the tension between them was palpable. Daniel's mind raced. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but something about this scene felt wrong. The difference in their ages, the way the girl kept glancing around the room like she was looking for an escape, it all added up to something that made Daniel's gut twist. He thought about walking over to them, striking up a conversation to see if he could get a read on the situation, but before he could make up his mind, the girl did something that made his heart skip a beat. She raised her hand just slightly, her palm facing outward, her fingers spread wide. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but Daniel knew exactly what it meant. It was a signal, a silent plea for help. He had seen it used before in high-stress situations where speaking out loud wasn't an option. It was a way to communicate when words were too dangerous. His pulse quickened. He couldn't be sure, of course. Maybe it was just a nervous tic, a random gesture made out of boredom or anxiety. But the way the girl's eyes met his for the briefest of moments, the way her hand trembled slightly before she lowered it back to her lap, it was enough to send Daniel's instincts into overdrive. Something was wrong. He glanced around the diner, noting the positions of the other patrons. The truckers at the counter were still engrossed in their meals, oblivious to the tension unfolding just a few feet away. The elderly couple in the corner was chatting quietly, their attention focused on each other. No one else seemed to notice the girl's distress. Daniel's mind raced as he considered his options. He could approach the pair, try to get a read on the man and the situation. But that could backfire. If the man was dangerous, confronting him directly might only escalate the situation. He could wait, keep watching, see if the girl gave another signal. But what if he waited too long? The girl glanced up at him again, her eyes wide and pleading. That was all the confirmation Daniel needed. Daniel set his coffee down, his decision made. He wasn't going to stand by and do nothing. Whatever was going on between the man and the girl, it was clear that she was scared, and Daniel wasn't about to leave her in that situation without finding out the truth. He stood, moving away from the counter and toward the vending machines at the back of the diner. From there, he could keep an eye on the pair without drawing too much attention to himself. As he leaned against the wall, pretending to examine the rows of candy bars and chips, he kept his gaze fixed on the man and the girl. The man hadn't noticed him yet. He was still pretending to read his newspaper, though Daniel could see that his eyes were fixed on the girl. The girl, for her part, was still fidgeting, her hands now twisting the fabric of her red dress into nervous knots. Daniel clenched his fists, trying to keep his emotions in check. He needed to stay calm, needed to assess the situation before acting. Rushing in without a plan could make things worse. He considered calling the police. But what would he say? That he had a bad feeling? That he had seen a girl make a hand gesture that might or might not have been a distress signal? It wasn't enough. He needed something more concrete before he could involve the authorities. His eyes flicked back to the man, and for a moment their gazes met. The man's expression didn't change. He didn't smile, didn't frown. He just looked at Daniel with cold, detached eyes before returning his attention to the newspaper. But something in that brief exchange sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. There was something off about this man. Daniel's military instincts kicked in, his mind racing through potential scenarios. If the man was a threat, what was his next move? Would he try to leave with the girl? Was there a chance he had a weapon? Daniel had been in high-pressure situations before, but this felt different. This wasn't a war zone, and the stakes here were different. He couldn't afford to act rashly, but he also couldn't afford to wait too long. The girl glanced up at him again, her eyes locking onto his for just a moment before darting away. There was fear in her gaze, but also something else, desperation. She wanted to leave, but she couldn't. Not without help. Daniel's pulse quickened as he considered his options. He could approach them, try to strike up a casual conversation, but that might only alert the man that something was wrong. Or he could wait for the girl to make another move, another signal, something that would give him the justification he needed to act. But what if he waited too long? As Daniel stood there wrestling with his decision, the man suddenly stood up. Daniel's heart skipped a beat as he watched the man reach across the table and grab the girl's arm. The movement was quick, too quick, and the girl flinched at contact. The man said something to her, his voice low and harsh, but Daniel couldn't hear the words from where he stood. Whatever the man had said, it was enough to make the girl's eyes widen in fear. She shrank back in her seat, her small body trembling as the man tightened his grip on her arm. Daniel's blood ran cold. This was it. He couldn't wait any longer. With quick, deliberate steps, Daniel moved toward the table, his eyes locked on the man. He didn't know what he was going to say, but he knew he had to act before the man had a chance to leave with the girl. The man glanced up as Daniel approached, his expression unreadable. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it that set Daniel on high alert. Daniel stopped a few feet away from the table, his posture relaxed but his senses on high alert. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, his tone casual but firm. The man's grip on the girl's arm tightened and she winced in pain. "Everything's fine," the man replied, though his voice was now laced with irritation. "We're just having a meal." Daniel's eyes flicked to the girl, who was staring down at the table, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. "Is that true?" Daniel asked, his voice soft as he addressed her directly. "Are you okay?" The girl didn't answer. She just shook her head slightly, her eyes filling with tears. That was all Daniel needed. "Let her go," Daniel said, his voice low and dangerous. The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Daniel thought he might refuse. But then, slowly, the man released his grip on the girl's arm, though his gaze never left Daniel's. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into," the man said, his voice cold and threatening. "This isn't your business." Daniel took a step closer, his body tensing. "I'm making it my business." The man stared at him for a long moment, and Daniel could feel the tension crackling between them like a wire pulled taut, ready to snap at any moment. But before either of them could make a move, the sound of sirens cut through the air. Daniel's heart leaped as the wail of sirens grew louder, the flashing lights of a police car reflecting off the windows of the diner. The man's face twisted in a mix of anger and fear as he glanced toward the door, realizing that his time was running out. The girl's eyes darted between Daniel and the man, her small frame trembling with fear. She didn't speak, but the silent plea in her eyes was clear. She needed help, and she needed it now. Daniel stepped forward, placing himself between the man and the girl, his body a shield as the police car screeched to a stop outside. The man's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he didn't make a move. He just stood there, glaring at Daniel with cold, calculating eyes. "You've made a mistake," the man hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "I know enough," Daniel replied, his voice steady. "And so do they." The door to the diner swung open, and two police officers stepped inside, their hands resting on their holsters as they surveyed the scene. The lead officer, a tall man with a stern expression, locked eyes with Daniel before turning his attention to the man. "Is there a problem here?" the officer asked, his voice calm but authoritative. The man straightened, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "No problem, officer," he said smoothly. "Just having a meal with my niece." The officer's eyes flicked to the girl, who was now sitting as still as a statue, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "Is that true?" the officer asked, his tone softening as he addressed her. The girl didn't answer right away. She just stared down at the table, her small body trembling. But then slowly she shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "No," she said. "I don't want to go with him." The officer's expression hardened. He turned to the man, his hand moving to his handcuffs. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the child and come with us." The man's face twisted in fury, but he didn't resist as the officer cuffed his hands behind his back. As he was led toward the door, the man shot one last venomous glance at Daniel, his voice low and filled with malice. "This isn't over." Daniel didn't respond. He just watched as the man was taken away, the tension in his body slowly easing as the danger passed. The girl remained seated at the table, her eyes wide with shock, but there was a flicker of relief in her gaze as she looked up at Daniel. "It's over now," Daniel said softly, kneeling down beside her. "You're safe." The girl didn't say anything, but she nodded, her small hands still trembling as she clutched the edge of the table. The officer who had cuffed the man returned, his expression serious but grateful. "Thank you for stepping in," he said, giving Daniel a nod of appreciation. "You probably saved her life." Daniel shook his head, still trying to process everything that had just happened. "I just couldn't stand by and do nothing." The officer nodded in understanding. "We'll take it from here. Do you mind sticking around to give a statement?" "Of course," Daniel replied, though his mind was already racing ahead to what came next. The girl was safe, but the story was far from over. The flashing lights from the squad cars painted the parking lot of the diner in shades of red and blue, casting long, shifting shadows across the gravel. Daniel stood by the booth, watching as the officers led the man, now handcuffed, toward one of the waiting cars. His mind buzzed with the adrenaline still coursing through his veins, but he forced himself to stay focused, stay grounded in the present. He couldn't afford to relax just yet. The man, Frank, as Daniel would soon learn, glared at him over his shoulder as the officers pushed him into the back of the squad car. His eyes were sharp with fury, and Daniel knew, deep in his gut, that Frank wasn't going to forget this. Whatever twisted plan had brought him here, to this diner, to this moment, wasn't over yet. Not in his mind. But for now, at least, he was in custody, and that meant the girl was safe. Daniel turned his attention back to the girl, who was still sitting in the booth, her small frame hunched forward, as if trying to make herself invisible. Her dark curls hung around her face, obscuring her features, but Daniel could see the way her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the table. She hadn't said much since the confrontation, hadn't moved from her seat, and Daniel wondered if she even understood what had just happened. The lead officer, a tall man with a stern expression and a calm demeanor, approached Daniel, his eyes scanning the scene with practiced efficiency. "Are you the one who called this in?" he asked, his voice low and professional. Daniel nodded, though his mind was still processing the events of the last few minutes. "Yeah, I saw something was wrong. The girl, she signaled for help." The officer's gaze flicked toward the girl, his brow furrowing slightly as he took in her hunched posture and wide, fearful eyes. "Good instincts," he said, giving Daniel a nod of approval. "Most people wouldn't have picked up on that." Daniel shrugged, feeling an odd sense of discomfort at the praise. He wasn't looking for recognition. He had done what anyone should have done. He had seen a child in danger, and he had acted. But he knew deep down that the officer was right. Most people wouldn't have noticed, or worse, they would have convinced themselves that it wasn't their problem. "Is she okay?" Daniel asked, his voice dropping to a softer tone as he glanced back at the girl. The officer followed his gaze, his expression softening slightly. "Physically, she's fine, but it's clear she's been through a lot. We'll need to get her to the station, see if we can figure out what's going on." Daniel nodded, feeling a tight knot form in his chest. The girl had been brave, braver than anyone her age should ever have to be. She had signaled for help, trusted a stranger to step in, and now she was sitting there, alone and scared, waiting for the next step in a nightmare that had only just begun. The female officer who had accompanied the lead officer approached the booth, kneeling down beside the girl with a soft smile. "Hi, sweetheart," she said gently, her voice soothing. "Can you tell me your name?" The girl hesitated for a moment, her small hand still gripping the edge of the table. She glanced up at the officer, her eyes wide and filled with uncertainty. But then, in a voice so soft that Daniel could barely hear it, she whispered, "Lily." The officer's smile widened slightly. "That's a beautiful name, Lily. My name's Officer Carter. We're here to help you, okay? You're safe now." Lily didn't respond, but she nodded, her grip on the table loosening just a little. Officer Carter stood, turning to Daniel and the lead officer. "We need to get her back to the station," she said softly. "Her father's on his way. He's been looking for her." Daniel felt a surge of relief on the news. The girl's father was on his way, and soon she would be back with someone who cared about her, someone who could protect her from whatever had been happening. The lead officer, Officer Evans, as Daniel had learned, nodded in agreement. "We'll take her back, get her statement, make sure she's safe." Evans turned back to Daniel, his expression once again serious and professional. "We'll need you to come with us, too. You're a key witness in this case, and we'll need a full statement from you." Daniel nodded, though his mind was already racing ahead to what might come next. He wasn't sure how deep this situation went, but he knew that it was far from over. The man, Frank, hadn't just been some random stranger. There was a plan behind his actions, something bigger than what had played out in the diner, and whatever that plan was, Daniel had a feeling it wasn't going to end with one arrest. As the officers escorted Lily out of the diner and into the waiting squad car, Daniel followed, his heart heavy with a mix of relief and uncertainty. The immediate danger was over, but the road ahead was still uncertain for Lily, for her father, and for Daniel himself. The drive to the police station was quiet. Daniel sat in the back of a squad car, watching the Wyoming landscape blur past the windows as the sun set on the horizon. The adrenaline from the confrontation faded, leaving behind a strange, hollow feeling in its place. He had done what needed to be done, but there was still so much he didn't understand, so much that was unresolved. Lily sat in the car ahead of him, her small figure barely visible through the rear window. Officer Carter sat with her, speaking softly, trying to coax her into talking, but from what Daniel could see, Lily hadn't said much. She was still in shock, still trying to process everything that had happened. Daniel knew that feeling all too well. He had felt it after every mission, every moment of danger that left him questioning what came next. The height of survival, followed by the crushing weight of uncertainty. When they arrived at the police station, Daniel followed the officers inside, his mind still racing with questions. Officer Evans led him to a small room off to the side where he would give his full statement about what had happened at the diner. The room was sparse, just a metal table, a few chairs, and a dim overhead light that cast harsh shadows across the walls. It was the kind of room Daniel had seen in countless crime dramas, but being on the other side of it, giving a statement as a witness rather than an enforcer, felt strange. Officer Evans sat across from him, a notepad in hand. "We're just going to go over what happened," he said, his tone professional but not unkind. "Take your time." Daniel nodded, leaning forward slightly as he began to recount the events of the diner, how he had noticed Lily and the man, how he had picked up on her distress signal, how he had confronted the man and stayed with Lily until the police arrived. As he spoke, the details came flooding back in sharp, vivid images, the way Lily had looked at him, her small hand rising just enough to signal for help, the cold fury in Frank's eyes as he realized his plan was falling apart. "She was scared," Daniel said, his voice quieter now as he reached the part of the story where he had approached the table. "But she was brave too. She didn't say much, but when I asked her if she was okay, she shook her head. That's when I knew I couldn't wait." Evans nodded, jotting down notes as Daniel continued. "And the man, Frank, he tried to play it off like they were family. He said she was his niece, but it was obvious she didn't want to go with him." The room fell silent for a moment as Evans finished writing. When he finally looked up, his expression was thoughtful. "You did the right thing," he said, his voice carrying a weight that Daniel wasn't sure how to process. Most people wouldn't have noticed, or worse, they would have convinced themselves it wasn't their problem. Daniel shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the praise. I couldn't ignore it. She needed help. And you gave it, Evans replied. You saved her. Daniel didn't respond. He wasn't sure how to. He had done what he felt was right, but the word hero didn't sit well with him. He hadn't felt like a hero in that moment. He had felt scared, uncertain, but driven by an instinct to protect. That was what he knew how to do. After the statement was finished, Evans stood, offering Daniel a nod of appreciation. We'll take it from here, he said. If we need anything else, we'll contact you. For now, just know that Lily is safe, and her father will be here soon. Daniel nodded, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. He had done what he could, but the emotional toll of the evening was starting to catch up to him. He hadn't realized how much it had taken out of him until now, sitting in this quiet room with nothing but his own thoughts to keep him company. As he left the room, he caught sight of Lily sitting in another part of the station, still clutching her stuffed animal as Officer Carter spoke gently to her. She looked so small, so fragile, and Daniel's heart ached for her. Her father would be here soon, and she would finally be safe. But for Daniel, the sense of closure he had been hoping for was still out of reach. There were too many unanswered questions about Frank, about what had led to this moment, about what came next for Lily and her father. And no matter how much he tried to push those questions aside, they lingered in the back of his mind, refusing to be ignored. It was nearly an hour later when Daniel heard the commotion near the front of the station. He had been sitting in a small waiting area, his mind wandering through the events of the day, when the sound of hurried footsteps and raised voices drew his attention. He looked up just in time to see a man rush through the door, his face a mixture of relief and fear. His clothes were rumpled, his hair disheveled, but there was palpable energy in the way he moved, like he had been running for miles and had finally reached his destination. "Lily," the man called, his voice cracking with emotion as he scanned the room. It didn't take long for him to spot her. Lily, who had been sitting quietly with Officer Carter, looked up at the sound of her name, her wide eyes filling with recognition. She stood up slowly, clutching her teddy bear tightly to her chest as the man rushed over to her. "Daddy!" she cried, her small voice breaking through the stillness of the station. The man dropped to his knees, pulling her into his arms in a tight, protective embrace. Daniel watched as the two of them held each other, the father whispering reassurances into his daughter's ear, as Lily buried her face in his chest, her small body trembling with relief. For a moment, everything else faded away. The fear, the uncertainty, the danger, it all seemed to melt into the background as father and daughter were reunited. There was a quiet beauty in the moment, a sense of something fragile being mended after nearly being torn apart. Daniel's chest tightened as he watched them, a lump forming in his throat. He had done what he could to protect Lily, but this was the moment that mattered. This was the moment that would bring her back from the edge of whatever darkness had threatened to swallow her whole. After a few moments, the man, James, as Daniel would later learn, looked up, his eyes red-rimmed with tears. He spotted Daniel standing a few feet away, and for a moment, the two men just stared at each other, an unspoken understanding passing between them. James stood, still holding Lily close, and walked over to Daniel. His face was a mix of gratitude and exhaustion, but there was a fire in his eyes that spoke of a father's unwavering love. "Thank you," James said, his voice raw with emotion. I don't know how to thank you enough. You saved my little girl." Daniel shook his head, feeling the familiar discomfort that came with being called a hero. I did what anyone would have done." James smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. Not everyone would have seen what you saw. Not everyone would have acted. Daniel didn't know what to say. He had never been good at accepting praise, especially in situations like this. He had done what needed to be done, but the weight of it all, the responsibility, the fear, still lingered in his chest. Lily looked up at him then, her small face peeking out from her father's arms. Her eyes were still wide with lingering fear, but there was something else there too, something that looked a lot like gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel smiled softly, kneeling down, so he was at eye level with her. "You were really brave, Lily. You did everything right." She nodded, though she didn't say anything else. Instead, she reached out and gently touched Daniel's sleeve, her small fingers brushing against the fabric in a gesture that was both simple and profound. It was a moment that would stay with Daniel for a long time, a moment that reminded him of why he had stepped in, why he had acted when others might have hesitated. He had saved a life that night. But as he watched Lily and her father walk out of the station, their steps slow and deliberate, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. There were still questions to be answered, still shadows lurking in the background, and he knew deep down that he wasn't done yet. The night wore on, and as the adrenaline of the evening faded, Daniel found himself sitting in the station's waiting area, lost in thought. The events of the past few hours played on a loop in his mind, the images sharp and vivid. Lily's frightened face, the cold fury in Frank's eyes, the moment of tension when Daniel had stood between them, unsure of what would happen next. It had been a close call. Too close. But Lily was safe now, and Frank was in custody. That should have been enough to bring Daniel a sense of closure, but the questions that had been lingering in the back of his mind refused to go away. Who was Frank? And why had he been so determined to take Lily? Officer Evans approached, pulling Daniel from his thoughts. The officer's expression was serious but calm, his posture relaxed as he sat down beside Daniel. "Frank's in holding," Evans said, his voice low. "We've started questioning him, but he's not saying much." Daniel nodded, though he wasn't surprised. Frank had struck him as the type to keep his cards close to his chest. Whatever his plan had been, he wasn't going to give it up easily. Evans leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "From what we've gathered so far, it looks like this wasn't just a random abduction. Frank had been planning this for a while." Daniel frowned, feeling a chill running down his spine. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made the situation feel all the more dangerous. "He had fake documents in his car," Evans continued. "A passport for Lily, plane tickets to a country we're still looking into. He was planning to take her out of the country." Daniel's stomach turned at the thought. He had known something was wrong from the moment he saw Frank and Lily in the diner, but he hadn't realized just how close Lily had come to disappearing, if he hadn't acted, if the police hadn't arrived in time. "What about her mother?" Daniel asked. His voice was low. "Does she know?" Evans sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "That's another piece of the puzzle we're trying to figure out. Her mother lost custody of Lily a few months ago after a long legal battle with her father. We're looking into whether she was involved in this plan with Frank." The thought made Daniel's chest tighten. It was one thing to think of Frank as the mastermind behind the abduction, but the idea that Lily's own mother could have been involved, could have been willing to take her daughter away from her father, possibly for good, was almost too much to bear. "What happens now?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll keep investigating," Evans replied. "But for now, Lily's safe. Her father's going to take her home, and we'll make sure they have the protection they need." Daniel nodded, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. Lily was safe, and that was what mattered most. But the road ahead was still long, still uncertain. As he stood to leave, Evans gave him a small nod of appreciation. "You did good tonight," he said, his voice firm. You saved her life." Daniel didn't respond. He didn't feel like a hero, didn't feel like he had done anything extraordinary. He had simply seen a child in danger and acted. But the weight of what had happened, the responsibility of it all, still hung heavily in his chest. He had saved her life, but the story wasn't over yet. Daniel sat in the small motel room, staring out the window at the highway beyond. The faint hum of traffic was a constant background noise, though out here in the middle of nowhere, there weren't many cars passing by. His truck sat in the parking lot just below his window, dusty from the miles he had driven over the past few weeks, though it had never seemed to take him anywhere that mattered. Now, after the events of the past few days, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he was drifting again, just like he had been before. The police station had been quiet when he left. Lily's father had taken her home, and the officers had assured Daniel that they would handle the investigation. Frank was in custody, and though he hadn't confessed much, they had enough evidence to hold him. The forged documents, the plane tickets, and Lily's own testimony were enough to prove that something much darker had been in the works. But despite knowing that Lily was safe, Daniel couldn't shake the nagging sense of unease that had settled in his chest. There were still too many unanswered questions. Why had Frank wanted to take Lily out of the country? What motivated him? And perhaps most troubling of all, what role had her mother played in all of this? It wasn't Daniel's job to figure those things out. He wasn't a detective, wasn't part of the investigation. His role in the story should have ended the moment the police arrived at the diner and took Frank into custody. But something about the situation had stuck with him. Lodged deep in his gut like a splinter he couldn't pull free. He had saved Lily, yes, but there was more to the story, and Daniel couldn't rest until he knew what it was. The motel room was small and bare, the kind of place that travelers stopped at for a night's sleep before continuing on their way. The bed was lumpy, the carpet stained, and the paint on the walls was chipped and faded. It wasn't exactly comfortable, but Daniel hadn't expected it to be. He wasn't here for comfort. He was here because he needed to be somewhere, and this was as good a place as any. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, the sudden sound breaking through the silence of the room. Daniel reached for it, half expecting it to be one of the officers calling to update him on the case, but when he saw the name on the screen, his heart skipped a beat. It was James Brooks, Lily's father. Daniel hesitated for a moment before answering, unsure of what James could want. He hadn't expected to hear from him again so soon, and he certainly hadn't expected a personal call. "Hello?" Daniel said. His voice was rough from the tension that still lingered in his throat. "Daniel, it's James, Lily's father." There was a pause on the other end, and Daniel could hear the emotion in James's voice, the strain of everything that had happened over the past few days. "I just wanted to thank you again for what you did for Lily." Daniel swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No," James said firmly. "You did more than that. You saw something that no one else saw. You acted when others would have looked the other way. I can never repay you for that." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, the familiar weight of guilt settling in his chest. He hadn't done it for thanks or recognition. He had done it because he couldn't stand the thought of a child in danger. But hearing the gratitude in James's voice, hearing the raw emotion in his words, made Daniel feel like he was carrying more responsibility than he was prepared for. "How's Lily?" Daniel asked, changing the subject to something safer. James let out a long sigh, the sound heavy with relief and exhaustion. She's doing okay. She's still scared, but she's home now. She's safe. That's what matters." Daniel nodded, though James couldn't see him. "I'm glad she's safe." There was another pause on the other end of the line, and Daniel could hear the faint sound of Lily's laughter in the background. It was a sweet, innocent sound, so different from the fear that had filled her voice when Daniel had first seen her at the diner. "I'm calling because—" James hesitated, as if unsure of how to continue. "Because Lily's been asking about you. She remembers what you did for her, and she's been asking if she can see you again." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected this. After everything that had happened, after all the danger and fear, the last thing he thought was that Lily would want to see him again. "I don't know if that's a good idea," Daniel said quietly. "I'm not sure if—" "She trusts you, Daniel," James interrupted. "She saw you as her protector. You were the one who stepped in when no one else did. I think it would help her to see you again, to know that everything is really over." Daniel was silent for a moment, his mind racing. He hadn't thought about his role in Lily's life beyond the diner. He had stepped in, yes, but he hadn't considered the long-term impact of his actions. He hadn't thought about what it would mean to be a part of her recovery. But now that James had said it, Daniel couldn't ignore the truth in his words. Lily did trust him. She had looked to him for help, for protection. And if seeing him again would help her feel safe, how could he say no? "All right," Daniel said finally. "I'll come by." The relief in James's voice was palpable. "Thank you, Daniel. This means more than you know." They made arrangements for Daniel to visit the following afternoon, and after hanging up, Daniel sat back in the chair, staring out the window at the fading light of the sunset. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to become a part of Lily's life beyond that brief moment in the diner. But now that it was happening, he realized that maybe he had been searching for something like this all along. The drive to James's house the next day was filled with a strange mix of anticipation and anxiety. As Daniel navigated the winding roads that led out of town and into the more rural areas, he couldn't stop thinking about what James had told him on the phone. Lily had been asking about him. She trusted him. She saw him as her protector. It was a heavy responsibility, one that Daniel wasn't sure he was ready for. But he couldn't deny that something inside him had shifted since that night at the diner. He had spent so long drifting, searching for meaning, and now, for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had found a purpose, something worth fighting for. James's house was a modest single-story home nestled at the edge of a quiet neighborhood. The yard was neatly kept, with a small garden of flowers blooming near the front porch. It was the kind of place that radiated warmth and safety, the kind of home where a child like Lily should feel protected and loved. As Daniel pulled into the driveway, he spotted Lily playing in the front yard with a ball, her laughter filling the air as she tossed the ball up and caught it with clumsy hands. She looked so different from the frightened, trembling girl he had met in the diner, so full of life, so full of joy. When Lily saw Daniel's truck pull up, her eyes lit up with recognition, and she ran toward the house, calling for her father. "Daddy, he's here!" James appeared at the door, a smile on his face as he watched his daughter run back and forth across the yard. He waved to Daniel as he stepped out of the truck, his expression one of gratitude and relief. "Daniel," James said warmly as he approached, "I'm so glad you could come." Daniel nodded, his eyes flicking back to Lily, who was now standing shyly by the porch, her hands clasped behind her back. "I'm glad I could be here." James gestured toward the front porch, where a couple of chairs sat beneath the shade of a large tree. "Come sit. I think there's a lot we need to talk about." As they sat down, Lily watched from a distance, still holding her ball, her eyes flicking between Daniel and her father. She seemed unsure of what to say or do, but Daniel could see curiosity and trust in her gaze. James sighed as he leaned back in his chair, his expression growing more serious. "There's something I need to tell you, Daniel." Something that I think you deserve to know after everything you did for Lily. Daniel frowned, leaning forward slightly. What is it? It's about Tina, James said quietly, his voice filled with a sadness that cut through the warm afternoon air. Lily's mother. Daniel's heart tightened at the mention of Tina. He had been wondering about her ever since the night at the diner, ever since the police had mentioned that she might have been involved in Frank's plan, but he hadn't asked, hadn't wanted to pry into something that felt too personal. James took a deep breath, his eyes distant as he began to speak. Tina and we were happy once. When Lily was born, things were good. We were a family. But over time, things changed. Tina changed. Daniel listened quietly, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the story. She became paranoid, James continued. Started talking about how the world wasn't safe, how she couldn't trust anyone. At first, I thought it was just stress, new mother jitters, you know. But it got worse. She started making plans, talking about taking Lily and disappearing. She said she needed to protect her. Daniel's chest tightened as he listened. This was the part of the story that had been missing, the reason why Tina had lost custody, the reason why Frank had been so determined to take Lily. I tried to get her help, James said softly, his voice filled with regret. But she wouldn't accept it. She pushed me away, and when the courts got involved, it became a custody battle. I didn't want it to come to that, but I had no choice. I had to protect Lily. Daniel nodded, understanding all too well the weight of that decision. Sometimes protecting the people you love meant making choices you didn't want to make. The court awarded me full custody after they saw how unstable Tina had become, James said. But I knew she wouldn't just give up. I knew she would try to take Lily, and that's exactly what she did. Tina was working with Frank? Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer. James nodded grimly. Yes, they had been planning it for months. Tina had convinced Frank that the only way to protect Lily was to take her away from me, from everyone. They were going to disappear, leave the country, start over somewhere else. If you hadn't stepped in when you did. He trailed off, his voice cracking with emotion. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine as he realized just how close Lily had come to being taken away from her father, possibly forever. If he hadn't seen the signs, if he hadn't acted when he did, Lily might have been lost to them all. I'm sorry, James said softly, his eyes filled with guilt. I should have done more. I should have seen the signs earlier. You did everything you could, Daniel replied, his voice steady. You protected her, that's what matters. James nodded, though the guilt still lingered in his eyes. I wish things hadn't ended like this. For a few moments, the two men sat in silence, the weight of everything that had happened hanging heavily in the air between them. The story was darker, more complicated than Daniel had realized, and it made him all the more grateful that Lily had been saved before it was too late. As they sat there, Lily approached cautiously, her small feet patting across the grass as she held her ball in her hands. She glanced up at Daniel, her eyes wide with curiosity. Can I show you something? She asked softly. Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and relief. Of course. Lily tossed the ball into the air, her small hands fumbling as she tried to catch it, but she laughed despite her clumsiness. It was the sound of a child who had been given a second chance, a sound that reminded Daniel of why he had acted, why he had risked everything to save her. James watched his daughter with a smile, though there was a sadness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Tina's in custody now, he said quietly, but it's not over. There will be a trial, and I'll have to explain to Lily why her mother won't be coming back. Daniel nodded, understanding the pain in James's voice. It was a conversation no father should ever have to have with his child. But at least Lily was alive. At least she was safe. And that was what mattered most. The days passed slowly, but with each one that went by, Daniel found himself more and more involved in Lily's recovery. James had welcomed him into their lives with open arms, and Lily had quickly grown attached to Daniel in a way that surprised him. She looked to him for reassurance, for protection, and every time Daniel saw her smile or heard her laugh, he felt a sense of pride that was unlike anything he had experienced before. But it wasn't just about Lily. As Daniel spent more time with her and James, he realized that he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. A sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. The aimlessness that had plagued him for so long, the feeling of drifting without direction, had started to fade. Lily was healing, slowly but surely. James had been open about the difficulties they were facing. Lily's nightmares, her fear of being taken away again, her confusion about why her mother had done what she had. It wasn't easy, but they were getting through it together, and Daniel was determined to help in any way he could. One afternoon, as they sat in the backyard watching Lily play, James turned to Daniel with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he began, his voice soft, "I think you've done more for Lily than anyone else." Daniel raised an eyebrow, unsure of what James meant. "I'm just doing what I can." "No," James said firmly. "You've been there for her in a way that no one else has. She trusts you. She feels safe with you." Daniel didn't know how to respond. He had never thought of himself as someone who could make that kind of impact on a child's life. But the truth was, he had grown attached to Lily too. She had become more than just the girl he had saved. She had become someone he cared about deeply. "She sees you as her protector," James continued. "And I think that's something she's needed for a long time." Daniel nodded, though the weight of James's words pressed down on him. It was a responsibility he hadn't asked for, but it was one he couldn't turn away from. Later that evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Daniel and James sat on the porch, the quiet night settling in around them. The conversation turned, as it often did, to the upcoming trial, to the questions they still didn't have answers for. "I don't know what's going to happen," James admitted, his voice filled with uncertainty. "But I do know one thing. I'll do whatever it takes to protect her." Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the stars overhead. "So will I." And in that moment, Daniel realized that this was what he had been searching for all along. Not just a purpose, but a reason to fight, a reason to protect. The trial came faster than anyone had expected. Tina had been charged with conspiracy to abduct a child, and Frank had faced similar charges. The courtroom was tense as the proceedings unfolded, and Daniel, though not directly involved, had attended every day, sitting quietly in the back, watching as Lily's life was put on display for the court to dissect. Lily had been called to testify, a moment that Daniel had dreaded but knew was inevitable. She had been brave, speaking in a quiet, trembling voice, as she recounted the events leading up to that fateful night at the diner. Daniel's heart had ached for her, but he had been there, sitting in the courtroom, giving her the reassurance she needed. The verdict came swiftly, guilty on all counts. It should have felt like a victory, but as Daniel watched Tina being led away in handcuffs, he couldn't shake the sadness that lingered in the air. This wasn't how things were supposed to end. A mother and her child torn apart, a family broken beyond repair. But as Daniel and James stood outside the courthouse, watching Lily chase a butterfly across the lawn, they knew that they had done the right thing. They had protected her. And in the end, that was all that mattered. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the grass, Daniel felt a sense of closure that had eluded him for so long. He had found his purpose. He had found his place. And for the first time in years, he felt at peace. The courtroom verdict had been read, the tension finally broken with the declaration of guilt. It should have brought Daniel a sense of finality, a feeling that the weight of everything that had transpired had been lifted. But as he stood outside the courthouse watching Lily play on the courthouse lawn, he realized the trial was only a small part of a much larger journey. The law had been served, yes, but the scars left by the ordeal would take time to heal, both for Lily and for those who cared about her. It had been a few days since the trial ended. Tina and Frank were both in custody, and James had begun the process of rebuilding his and Lily's lives, this time without the shadow of fear looming over them. Daniel had stayed close to the family, providing whatever support he could. But now that the immediate danger had passed, he found himself unsure of where he fit into the picture. He had done his part, had been the one to step in when no one else had. But the road ahead wasn't a battleground. It wasn't about bravery or instinct anymore. It was about patience and healing. And that was something Daniel wasn't sure he knew how to help with. The crisp fall air was cool as Daniel sat on the porch of James's home, watching the leaves tumble down from the tall trees surrounding the property. Lily's laughter echoed faintly in the distance as she ran around the yard, chasing after the neighbor's dog. The sound was a stark contrast to the fear and uncertainty that had once filled her voice. "She's doing better," James said, stepping onto the porch and sitting down beside Daniel. His voice was tired but filled with quiet relief. "She's still having nightmares, but she smiles more now." Daniel nodded, his gaze following Lily's small figure as she darted between the trees. "She's a strong kid," he replied, "stronger than most adults I've met." James chuckled softly, though his eyes remained serious. "That's because of you, you know." Daniel turned to him, frowning. "I didn't do anything special." "Yes, you did," James said firmly, leaning forward in his chair. "You gave her a reason to believe that she could be safe again. You stepped in when no one else would have, and because of that, she's still here." "That's not nothing, Daniel." The weight of James's words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Daniel didn't know how to respond. He had never been one for praise, had always seen his actions as simply doing what needed to be done. But hearing James say it, hearing the raw gratitude in his voice, it made Daniel realize that maybe, just maybe, he had made a bigger impact than he had allowed himself to believe. "I was just following my instincts," Daniel said quietly, his voice almost apologetic. "I couldn't just stand by and watch." "And that's exactly why you're so important to her," James replied. "Because you didn't stand by, you acted, and now she knows there are people in this world she can trust." Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring out at the yard. He had been searching for so long, drifting from place to place, trying to find something that made sense of everything he had seen, everything he had experienced in his life. And now, here in this small town, with this small family, he realized that maybe he had found it. "Do you think she'll be okay?" Daniel asked after a long pause, his voice filled with uncertainty. James was silent for a moment before nodding slowly. "It'll take time, but yes, I think she'll be okay. She has people who love her, people who will protect her. That's more than most kids in her situation have." Daniel nodded, though the uncertainty still lingered in his chest. He knew that the healing process would be long and difficult, but he also knew that Lily had already come so far. She had faced fear and danger head-on, and she had survived. Now it was time for her to live. "She's lucky to have you," Daniel said, glancing at James. "Not every father would have fought as hard as you did." James smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "I didn't have a choice. I had to protect her." Daniel understood that feeling all too well. The instinct to protect, to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves, was something that had been ingrained in him during his years in the Marines. It was a part of who he was, a part of what had driven him to step in and save Lily that night at the diner. But now, for the first time, Daniel felt something more than just the drive to protect. He felt a sense of responsibility, a sense of belonging. He wasn't just an outsider looking in on someone else's life anymore. He was a part of this family, whether he had intended it or not. "Daniel," James said softly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "I know this might sound strange, but I think Lily sees you as more than just the man who saved her. I think she sees you as part of her life now." Daniel frowned, turning to look at James. "What do you mean?" James sighed, leaning back in his chair and running his hand through his hair. "She talks about you all the time. She looks up to you. You've become a part of her world, and I think she needs that right now." Daniel was silent, unsure of what to say. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to become so intertwined in Lily's life. But now that it was happening, he realized that he didn't want to walk away from it. He didn't want to leave her behind. "I don't know if I'm the right person for that," Daniel said quietly, his voice filled with doubt. "I'm not exactly father material." James chuckled softly, though there was no judgment in his eyes. "You don't have to be her father, you just have to be there for her. That's all she needs right now." Daniel looked out at the yard again, watching Lily laugh and played with the dog. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the scene, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt a sense of peace. Maybe this was where he was meant to be. The weeks following the trial passed by in a blur of quiet moments and slow recovery. Lily had returned to school, though her teachers had been informed of the situation, and extra care was being taken to ensure that she felt safe and supported. Daniel had found himself becoming more and more involved in her life, spending afternoons with her and James, helping out wherever he could. It was a new role for him, one he hadn't anticipated, but one he found himself embracing more and more each day. Lily trusted him, and with that trust came a responsibility that Daniel took seriously. He wasn't just the man who had saved her anymore. He was someone she looked up to, someone she relied on. And that realization had changed something in Daniel. It had given him a new sense of purpose, one that went beyond the instinct to protect. He wanted to help Lily rebuild her life, to give her the tools she needed to face the world without fear. He wanted to be a part of her journey, not just as a protector, but as a guide. One afternoon, as Daniel and Lily sat on the porch together, Lily turned to him with a serious expression. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," Daniel replied, leaning forward slightly. "Do you think I'll ever be normal again?" Lily's voice was quiet, almost hesitant, as if she was afraid of the answer. Daniel's heart ached at the question, but he forced himself to smile gently. "You're already normal, Lily. You've just been through something really hard, and it's going to take time to heal. But you're strong, and you have people who care about you. You'll be okay." Lily nodded, though her eyes were filled with uncertainty. "But what if I'm scared forever? What if I can't stop thinking about what happened?" Daniel sighed, reaching out to gently place a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay to be scared, Lily. What happened to you was really scary, and it's normal to feel like that. But you don't have to go through it alone. You have me, and you have your dad. We'll be here for you no matter what." Lily looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Promise?" "Promise," Daniel said firmly, squeezing her shoulder gently. In that moment, Daniel realized that his role in Lily's life wasn't just about protecting her from physical danger. It was about helping her navigate the emotional aftermath of what had happened. It was about giving her the tools she needed to heal, to face her fears, and to move forward. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like he had found a purpose that went beyond the battlefield. As the days turned into weeks, Daniel began to think more seriously about his future. He had spent so long drifting, unsure of where he was headed, but now he knew he wanted to stay in Lily's life, to be there for her as she continued to heal. And beyond that, he wanted to use what he had learned, both in the military and in his experience with Lily, to help others. He began researching organizations that worked with children in crisis, looking for ways to get involved. There were so many kids like Lily, kids who needed someone to step in and protect them, to guide them through the darkness. Daniel knew that he had the skills and the experience to make a difference, and for the first time he felt like he had found a path that made sense. One afternoon, as he sat with James on the porch, Daniel broached the subject. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice thoughtful. "I want to do more. I want to help kids like Lily." James looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean, there are so many kids out there who need someone to protect them, to help them through tough times. I've been looking into organizations that work with kids in crisis, and I think that's something I want to do." James smiled, his eyes filled with admiration. "That sounds like a perfect fit for you, Daniel. You've already made such a difference in Lily's life, and I know you can do the same for others." Daniel nodded, feeling a sense of excitement building in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life. He wasn't just drifting anymore. He had found a purpose, a direction. "I think it's time I stop running," Daniel said quietly. "It's time I start giving back." James nodded, his expression serious. "Whatever you decide to do, just know that you'll always be a part of this family. You've done so much for Lily and for me. We'll always be grateful." Daniel smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly. "I'll always be here for Lily. And for you." Several weeks after the trial, Daniel found himself once again driving through the familiar streets toward James's house. This time, however, there was a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. The tension that had hung over him like a cloud was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing he had found his place in the world. James had invited him over for a barbecue, a small gathering to celebrate Lily's return to normalcy. It wasn't a formal event, just a few friends and neighbors, along with the small, tight-knit family that had formed in the aftermath of the ordeal. As Daniel pulled into the driveway, he was greeted by the sight of Lily playing with a group of neighborhood kids in the front yard. Her laughter echoed through the air, bright and carefree, and Daniel couldn't help but smile at the sound. She had come so far since that fateful night at the diner, and seeing her so happy, so full of life, was all the proof Daniel needed that he had made the right choices. James greeted Daniel with a handshake and a smile, pulling him into a quick hug. "Glad you could make it," he said warmly. "Lily's been asking about you all morning." Daniel chuckled, though his heart swelled with pride. "I wouldn't miss it." The backyard was filled with the smell of grilling burgers and the sound of cheerful conversation. It was a scene of normalcy, a far cry from the tense, fearful moments that had defined the past few months. And yet, in this quiet, peaceful setting, Daniel found a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. As the afternoon wore on, Daniel found himself sitting at a picnic table with James and a few of their friends, watching Lily as she played with the other kids. She was laughing, her dark curls bouncing as she ran around the yard, her smile wide and carefree. "She's come a long way," James said softly, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and relief. Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on Lily. "She's a tough kid, "That's because of you," James said, turning to look at Daniel. "You gave her the strength to believe she could be okay again." Daniel shook his head, though there was a warmth in his chest that he couldn't deny. "She had the strength all along. I just helped her find it." James smiled, though his eyes were filled with gratitude. "You've become a part of her life, Daniel, a part of our family. I don't think I'll ever be able to thank you enough for that." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat, though he forced himself to smile. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad she's okay." The afternoon stretched on, the sun beginning to dip low in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the yard. As the barbecue began to wind down, Lily approached Daniel, her eyes wide with excitement. "Can you come play with her?" she asked, her voice filled with hope. Daniel smiled, standing up from the picnic table. "Of course." For the next hour, Daniel played with Lily and the other kids, chasing them around the yard, laughing and smiling in a way he hadn't done in years. It was a simple joy, but one that filled him with a sense of peace he hadn't realized he was missing. As the sun set and the guests began to leave, Daniel sat on the porch with James, watching the last rays of light disappear behind the trees. Lily was inside getting ready for bed, her laughter still echoing faintly through the house. "Thank you, Daniel," James said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "For everything." Daniel nodded, his heart full. "I'm just glad I could help." And in that moment, as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Daniel realized that he had found what he had been searching for all along, a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. He wasn't just a drifter anymore. He wasn't lost. He was home. As the weeks turned into months, Daniel's life continued to change in ways he hadn't expected. He had become a fixture in Lily's life, someone she looked up to, someone she trusted. And with that trust came a sense of responsibility that Daniel had fully embraced. He had also followed through on his decision to get involved with children in crisis, volunteering with a local organization that provided support and protection to kids in dangerous situations. It was work that gave Daniel a renewed sense of purpose, a way to use his skills and experience to make a real difference in the world. But beyond that, Daniel had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for: a family. James and Lily had welcomed him into their lives with open arms, and over time Daniel had come to see them as more than just friends. They were his family now, a connection that went beyond blood or circumstance. They were the people who had given him a reason to stop running, a reason to stay. One evening, as Daniel sat on the porch of James's home, watching Lily play in the yard, he felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the landscape, and the air was filled with the sound of crickets chirping in the distance. It was a simple moment, but one that Daniel cherished. For the first time in years, he wasn't searching for something, he wasn't running. He was exactly where he was meant to be. Lily ran up to the porch, her face flushed with excitement. "Look, Daniel," she said, holding up a small butterfly she had caught. "Isn't it pretty?" Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "It's beautiful, Lily." Lily beamed, her eyes shining with happiness as she carefully released the butterfly back into the air, watching as it fluttered away into the evening sky. And as Daniel watched her, he realized that he had found something far more important than he had ever imagined. He had found a reason to stay, a reason to fight, a reason to protect. He had found a family. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of courage, redemption, and finding purpose. If this story moved you as much as it did us, don't forget to hit subscribe and click the bell icon to get notified whenever we share more stories of hope, resilience, and extraordinary acts of bravery. We have many more inspiring tales just waiting to be told. So stay tuned, and if you want more powerful stories like this one, stay safe and always remember, sometimes the smallest actions can make the biggest difference.